Good afternoon, everyone. So, I'm the founder of Synapse Labs, and what we work on is making AI accessible for everyone. And what I'd like to take you through today is to take a look at how AI can be made accessible, especially for people in Sri Lanka and in countries like Sri Lanka. So if we talk about AI, that's a subject that doesn't go missed in many conversations. I'm sure regardless of who you talk to, whether it's someone in the AI field, in the IT field, or anyone in general, AI does pop up in discussion. We see a lot of brands try to incorporate AI into their products, regardless of what the product is. And we see a lot of people, whether they are related to AI or not, speaking about it. But the real question is, where is AI if AI is here? Where is here? Because we see a lot of Sri Lankan businesses that haven't incorporated AI or are trying to figure out ways in which to do so. We see that AI sometimes doesn't understand our language. We see that AI isn't trained on our data. So those are some of the key concerns for businesses or for businesses that grow in countries like Sri Lanka. So the way I see it, there are three real constraints that we as low-resource languages, low-resource nations, and low-resource communities have to face. The first being data scarcity. So the area that I focus on is mainly NLP, and that comes with a lot of language-related data. So if we take Sinhala and Tamil, we have a very small COPA compared to languages like English. Secondly, the second constraint is compute limitations. So for Sri Lankan startups, funding is one of the key issues that we face. So compute limitations because of resources and because of lack of funding becomes a key issue as well. And the third issue, as I see it, is talent mismatch. We have great developers, excellent developers, in fact, in Sri Lanka, but finding that localization and adapting to the requirements of the Sri Lankan community and communities such as ours is an area that we need to improve on. So before I go on to what AI accessibility is and how we can improve on that, let me ask you a quick question. If I were to ask you how many languages are there currently spoken in the world, how many would you guess there are? Any guesses? Let's make this a bit interactive. Anyone? All right, 3, 2, 1. So we have 7,000 plus languages around the world, right, in different scales. You have languages like English, spoken by millions or billions rather. And you have languages like Sinhala, which are spoken by a few. In total, we have over 7,000 plus languages. Now, if we were to ask you another question, how many of this 7,000 plus languages would you need to cover 60% of the globe? 60% of the globe. How many do you think you'd need? You'd need 40 languages. With just 40 languages, you can cover over 60% of the population. And that's what most businesses are working on. Most global companies target this 40 languages, give or take a few more. But that's where languages like Sinhala, languages like Tamil get left out. So to look at put this into context for Sinhala and Tamil, Sinhala has 20 million speakers, mainly in Sri Lanka. Tamil has about 90 million spread globally. And if you put that into context of data, we are looking at 0.01% of the data for Sinhala and 0.07 for Tamil. So to give you a bit of a visualization on this, if you were to take a book that counted 10,000 pages, only one single page would be written in Sinhala, and only 7 would be written in Tamil. Whereas 45% of the pages, or 4,500 out of the 10,000 pages, would be in English. That is the type of dilemma that we're dealing with in terms of data availability for our models. And that in turn has models built for languages like English and other large or high resource languages, whereas low resource languages like Sinhala or Tamil get left out. So why does this matter? So the work that we do at Synapse AI revolves around marketing technology, or MarTech. And one of our key products, Common Pool, mainly works on analyzing social media data. So imagine if we were to work with brands in Sri Lanka, and they were only able to analyze English content. That would not give a full picture. That would not give a holistic view of people's opinions. And those people then get marginalized and left out from the decision making. Their voices don't get heard. Similarly, if, let's say, a practical limitation, for example, let's say a student wants to work out some homework in Tamil, and you compare it with someone working out the same homework in English, you see a lot more support for the English speaker compared to a Tamil speaker. Now, AI is at a point where it can change that gap, or reduce that gap rather, and that's what we are working on. So at Synapse AI, what we believe is that if big AI models ignore us, then build our own solutions for it. And that is one of the key messaging and the key USP that we brought up when we brought Common Pool. So I'll show you a few examples in which Common Pool adjusts to the localization, to local languages, and so on. But to give you a quick intro into what we do, we perform multilingual social listening. So what social listening is, we try to monitor various sources online, whether it's social media data, whether it's news articles, blogs, forums, videos, and so on. And then we extract information or extract insights based on that. So whether it is looking at various topics being discussed, the sentiment around a brand, and so on, we can provide that data from the data we collect. So the problem with working with multilingual data came up when we tried to cluster information. So why clustering mattered for us is because brands tend to get thousands of mentions on a daily basis or even a weekly basis, and that becomes a bit of an overload. So being able to bite-size it or being able to cluster it into different topics helps the users, the end user, to understand sentiment or understand discussion a lot better and bring it into manageable sized chunks. It's also important in terms of understanding viral trends, understanding key user pain points, performing campaign analysis, and so on. So that being said, one of the key issues that we faced is the multilingual clustering. So for example, when we initially tried clustering, every time when we performed the clustering, all of the language silos were created. What language silos is, essentially, all of the Sinhala mentions or Sinhala discussion would go into one big cluster with subclusters for different topics. And you have English mentions in one cluster and Tamil mentions in a different cluster for the Sri Lankan context. Now, for example, if someone said, Ada Viduliya Kapala, and someone else said, the electricity has gone out, they're essentially the same topic, but they were not in the same cluster. This is because initially we were using monolingual embeddings to reinforce, and that reinforced those language silos. So we were clustering based on language and syntax, as opposed to clustering based on meaning. So as a solution, what we brought out is multilingual sentence transformers that are able to bring all of these different mentions or bring all of these different discussions into one single vector space. So this vector space is a unified language agnostic vector space where you are actually clustering then based on the meaning of the words rather than the language that it's written in. So what that turns language into is simply another medium rather than a limiting factor. So the pipeline for this is quite simple. We collect the mentions from different sources in different languages. We detect language, and we perform a lot of other analysis on it as well. Then we embed using a multilingual sentence transformer into a single vector space. And we cluster using things like HTTP scan also, and then we visualize those clusterings for our end user. So that is to do with clustering. So to get you another example on looking at how LLMs are redefining how we work with languages. When we first started Common Pool, we didn't have LLMs at that time a few years ago. We had transformers, but transformer training was quite expensive. It wasn't very feasible for us to have multilingual transformers that were very efficient. So what we had was traditional NLP that used hand-built or handcrafted models and different pipelines for each language. So we would have an initial language classifier, break it down into various different languages, and then have models that work well for each individual language. Now, the problem with this is that you have different levels of accuracies for each of the different languages, and you also are not able to onboard new languages very rapidly because you have to go through a huge training process for that. But when LLMs came, it changed the way that we'd operate. LLMs learn with multiple languages jointly rather than separate pipelines. And models like Palm or Gemini support over 100 languages out of the box and can bring accuracies for a variety of further languages just by simple fine-tuning or even prompt engineering in certain cases. So what this meant is that we no longer needed to start from scratch, but rather we could build up on existing models, or existing LLMs rather, and serve the same solutions. So that meant that low resource now no longer meant unsupported. Another thing that came up was to do with fine-tuning. So the fine-tuning costs in 2022, if you wanted to fine-tune a new language into an LLM, would have cost you over $10,000, which is practically not very feasible for a startup in Sri Lanka. But with adapter-based tuning, as well as Google Vertex AI and also Gemini support for effective or efficient fine-tuning, we're now able to fine-tune models for example, Sinhala or Tamil or even other languages under $500, which is a lot more accessible in terms of cost for businesses that operate in Sri Lanka. So what this means for Sri Lankan businesses is that we don't need to wait for official support. We don't need to wait for global models to provide support for Sri Lanka, for our languages. We can train our own AI assistants. We can create our own chatbots in Sinhala. We can then educate using those language models as well. What that means for AI inclusivity is that it's no longer about wealth or the access to wealth. Rather, it's about the willingness to try and develop models that work for our languages, that work for our communities. So now, the next thing that we were able to look into is Singlish. So how many of y'all, can I get a raise of hands, how many of y'all use Singlish on a regular basis? I assume everyone knows what Singlish is, right? Yeah, so quite a few of you, right? So Singlish often lacks consistent spelling. It lacks structure. Everyone writes in their own unique way. It's not an actual language. It's what we call a pseudo-language. And most of the discussions online happen in Singlish in the Sri Lankan context if you are writing in Sinhala, compared to writing in Sinhala. But a lot of the models don't support Singlish, or a lot of the competitors that we work with didn't use to support Singlish or don't support it even at the moment. But what we were able to do is, through fine-tuning LLMs and through prompt-based normalization strategies, we're able to incorporate languages or pseudo-languages like Singlish into our pipelines as well, thereby making our models accessible for a lot more communities, a lot more users compared to what we were able to do previously. Now, a few lessons that we learned along the way. One, with regards to low-resource environments, we learned that starting with multilingual pre-trained models is the way to go, rather than building from scratch. Start with multilingual pre-trained models, then perform transfer learning for those models. For that, use public data, leverage large APIs that are open through things like product reviews, forums, and so on to train that data. Annotate it incrementally with LLM bootstrapping and also through manual corrections, and that tends to give you a really good result. But another thing that we saw is that prompt-based pipelines can also reduce expensive fine-tuning as well. So most of the LLMs come with the capability to work with a large number of languages, large number of distinct communities, languages, dialects, and also pseudo-languages. As long as you are able to get the prompts right, you would be able to work with them as out of the box itself, rather than having to necessarily go through expensive fine-tuning steps as well. So for prompt engineering, what we saw is that before you fine-tune, try to prompt smartly. If it doesn't work, then go for the fine-tuning stage. Use things like zero-shot or few-shot prompts to get structured outputs. And structured outputs is the king. Structured outputs tends to work best, especially with the type of domain that we worked with. So now, why is this important for Sri Lankan businesses? What is LLMs? What is AI bringing out in Sri Lanka? Now, a lot of people tend to say that Sri Lankan businesses or Sri Lankans or Sri Lanka as a whole is behind. People say that we are behind in technology, we are behind in digitalization, we are behind in the AI age. And people say that we are behind because we are constrained. We are constrained by resources, we are constrained by finances, and so on. But what I believe is that constraint breeds creativity. We should use those constraints to be forced to be resourceful. If we are able to work with the resources that we have, then we can work with any type of other resources as well. So if AI works here, it can work anywhere. And to give you a bit of an example there, so I took the example of Singlish previously. Some of you that know me might know that I used to live in Malaysia. And when I say Singlish in Malaysia, it doesn't refer to Sinhala in English. It refers to Singaporean English, right? So Singaporean English is a similar form of English to Singlish, where they have Cantonese, Malay, Tamil, and a few other languages mixed in due to the environment that Singapore is in. But the exact same issue lies. There's no direct language rules. There's no proper way of writing. But rather, it's an informal method of communicating. And what we realize is that most Asian nations have the same problem. So in Sri Lanka, we have Tamil in English. In India, they have Hindi in English, and so on, in different countries. So we were recently working with one client in Bangladesh. They have the exact same problem with Bengali in English. So if we are able to build a solution that works for Sri Lanka, then we are able to deploy it quite easily for those countries as well. So where I want to take you to next is a final note to say that AI isn't magic, it's a tool. Instead of being consumers of AI, what we should try to do is to be creators of it. don't chase the hype, try to solve real-world problems, and build solutions that work for Sri Lanka that can be then taken out to the globe, and not wait for someone to import those solutions back here. So with that, I move on to the end of my slides. I believe there are some questions out there as well, and we can move on to them. Right, so we have a few questions that have come up. Right, so this is a common question that has come up. I want to make my team self-aware about what they're doing without solely depending on AI. Right, so without removing AI from the team, how do I manage the situation to tell my team that AI cannot do everything? So that's a problem that I face with my team as well. I think a lot of project managers will be facing this. We see that AI is being used for everything. What I tell my team is AI is great, but it's not going to replace you. So a lot of people ask me whether AI will replace us, but no, AI won't. But what AI will do is it'll allow you to be more creative, allow you to work with a lot more data, a lot more resources. So use the AI creatively. So for example, one way in which developers use AI is to write code. But when you write the code, if you don't think about it, or if you start writing, start prompting the AI to generate the code, and something goes wrong, what we see is the developers tend to ask it to fix the bug. The bug fix, at least from my experience, tends to create more bugs than solve the bug, especially if you do it iteratively over and over again. That is, in my experience, what we've seen. So what I'd recommend is, if you do go through a few different stages and you're still seeing bugs coming in through your generated code, go back, step back, go back to scratch, and start again. Now, of course, I wouldn't say don't use AI in your work life. Use it as much as you can, but don't be over-reliant on it. Because ultimately, there's going to be a point where your coding skills, your intuition, and your experience will come into question, or will be what determines whether the code works or not. And therefore, always refresh your skills and not just stick to AI. Right, so another good question with regards to Singlish. How do we deal with ambiguity when it comes to mixed content like Singlish, especially when given with low COPA? Right, so yes, Singlish doesn't have a lot of structured data, right? We don't have data sets in Singlish as much as we'd like. There are a few, but not very robust or not very large. But what we do have is we have a lot of unstructured data out there, the data in the wild. So that data can be used, or should be used rather, to train our models, and that would generally work well. Another thing that I've seen is that most of the LLMs then do tend to be trained on real world, on the wild data. And because of that, those LLMs do tend to perform quite well. It just requires a bit of fine-tuning to match your specific needs, to match your specific use case, and so on. All right, so another question. What's the best approach to build singular voice agents? Well, I wouldn't say there's one particular best approach, but rather it would be the same method in which you would use to build any voice agent, but It would, of course, require a lot of fine-tuning, especially to get the voice right, because a lot of the singular voice agents that you have at the moment don't get the accent right. So you do understand that it is a fake or it is AI-generated content. So you do need a lot of fine-tuning in that sense. To get the text to voice, that is the key goal there, or the key hurdle there, as opposed to the generating the text or generating the underlying text that needs to be voiced out. Is a pretty much a solved problem at this point. But the vocalizing stage is where we are stuck at a bit, in my opinion. So again, a bit of fine-tuning is necessary there, and also working with other languages or models that cater to a lot of languages in the South Asian region would be a good starting point as well, because the dialects or the way that we speak tends to be relatively similar. Right. Right. We have another question. The general purpose LLMs like Gemini. All right. In general purpose LLMs like Gemini is performing quite good with. Right. So the question is, general purpose LLMs like Gemini performs very well with low resource languages like Sinhala. And is that a phase in development? Is it a challenge for startups in Sri Lanka? I would say not really. It's good to have general purpose LLMs work well on languages like Sinhala. They do work quite well, but from our own research, what we see is that they don't perform as well as English would. But it doesn't become a challenge for startups in Sri Lanka, but rather a benefit for startups in Sri Lanka, I'd say, where you now have a baseline to build upon. You can then use that as a stepping stone to improve upon those models, then move into other, pseudo languages like Singlish or so, when building your models. Now, of course, that might be a challenge if you're building simply a model for singular LLMs or for singular content generation, then yes, that would probably be a competitor to you. But again, with certain fine-tuning, you should still be able to generate a much better model than a generalized LLM would. Right, so the next question is again to do with Singlish. Currently, where are we in regards to incorporating Singlish into AI tools, and what does the future hold in regards to that? It's very difficult to answer that because we are at different stages in different tools. For global products or for global brands, Singlish isn't a priority. It simply isn't. Sinhala wasn't a priority either. So for global products, incorporating Singlish is not really a priority. That is why local startups or local development needs to happen in this regard. But that being said, just developing for Singlish would not take you anywhere as well. You need to develop something that would work with multiple other languages, like I mentioned, with Bengali in Bangladesh. If you could work with a model that could work for any language or work with any pseudo language rather, that would be the game changer. Building that and then taking it out of Sri Lanka is where you would be able to position yourself well in. So the real question you should be asking is, how are we doing in terms of pseudo languages, not just Singlish? And can we build a system that works for Singlish as a test bed, but then that can be replicated across languages in Asia and in Africa? So with that, I believe the time's up for all the questions. If you do have any further questions, do reach me later, and I'd be happy to have a chat with you. Thanks, everyone, for having me. Thanks, Google I/O.